All right. Good morning, and thank you to everyone for attending our second JAGNES Graduate Student Conference over Zoom. My name is Brooke Norton, and I'm the co-editor-in-chief for JAGNES. Although we originally planned to hold the conference this past spring, we had to make the hard last-minute decision to postpone the conference due to COVID-19. Lebna Safi, my co-editor-in-chief, and I want to sincerely thank everyone participating in the conference for working with us and for being so understanding during this whole process. JAGNES, short for the Journal of Associated Graduates in Near Eastern Studies, was active during the 1990s until 2008, when the journal was stopped due to lack of funds for printing. When we reestablished the journal in 2017, we believed that an online platform would offer graduate students a chance to explore new directions, both in their field of research and in the ways they approach publication. As a graduate student-led journal, we understand both the vital role of graduate students as well as innovative writing and research in this process. In an effort to facilitate the interdisciplinary and continued study of the Near East, the mission of JAGNES is to promote unconventional and non-traditional approaches and methodologies within Near Eastern studies. We hope to include in our journal the future of the discipline, whether that future is in new historiographies of the region or its parts, new technologies or reconstructions, or new forms of academic writing. Restarting this journal has been a long process, and we are happy to announce that our latest issue, Hard Times, Critical Approaches to Crisis and Its Aftermath, which was the theme of our first conference, is now available on our eScholarship page. Lebna and I have been working together to reestablish this journal for the past 4 years, and this process has been a steep learning curve to learn how to run a journal and plan conferences. I personally have enjoyed working with my fellow graduate students and having the chance to meet students and faculty across Berkeley and other universities. This year, Lebna and I both felt it was time to step down since we have invested much time in the journal and to let new students in on the process. Jessica Johnson and Jenna Stover-Kemp will take over as co-editors-in-chief for JAGNES this semester. They're both amazing colleagues, and I'm very happy to see where they take the journal. Before we begin, and I introduce the moderator for our first panel, I would like to say a few words of thanks. This conference would not have been possible without the support and sponsorship of certain people. First, we would like to thank the Near Eastern Studies Department at UC Berkeley. Throughout the whole process of reestablishing JAGNES, Professor Nick Bildhaus, who is our faculty advisor, has been immensely helpful to us. He was always available to give us advice and recommendations when we needed it. We would like to thank the department for generously purchasing Zoom webinar for use for this conference. We are also appreciative of the Near Eastern Studies Chair, Francesca Rochberg, and the department staff, Sharina Kurtz-Kitty, Charlene Mulder, Rania Shah, and Deanna Kaiser-Go, who have all been very supportive. We would also like to thank the Townsend Center and the Graduate Assembly at UC Berkeley for the fundings that we received. Finally, I would like to thank the other conference committee members who have all put so much time into planning the conference this year. Lebna Safi, Jess Johnson, Jason Silvestri, and Terry Tanaka, who has been an excellent mentor to all of us since planning our first conference. I would now like to introduce the moderator for our first panel, Adam Anderson. Adam Anderson is a Mellon postdoctoral fellow in the digital humanities at UC Berkeley. He is a D-Lab Senior Data Science Fellow, consultant, and instructor. His work brings together the fields of archaeology and computational linguistics to quantify the social and economic landscapes emerging during the late 3rd to early 2nd millennia in the ancient Near East. Visualizing early Assyrian and Sumerian social networks, Anderson's research focuses on tracking the flow of people and the exchange of commodities in Bronze Age societies. Thank you again, Adam, for moderating our first panel, and take it away.
Great, thank you. It's wonderful to be here again. I'm glad that the conference was able to happen live on Zoom now. And I'm hopeful that we'll be able to have a nice exchange today. Before I introduce our first speaker, I'd like to encourage everyone who's here to use the Q&A while you're listening to the talk. The whole point of this is to be able to not just passively listen to some very interesting talks as if we were listening to a podcast, but rather to actually get the opportunity to engage with the author and to ask questions and hopefully have an exciting conversation after the talk. So please think about the questions and put them in the Q&A option, and we will pull from those to have an exciting conversation as soon as their talks have finished. All right, so our first speaker today is Sarah Moore. She's a PhD candidate in Assyriology and certificate student in public humanities at Brown University. Her work focuses on concepts of secrecy and hidden writing in ancient Mesopotamia and digital methods for exploring the ancient world. She also serves as a managing editor for the public scholarship blog, The Ratty. And we'll look forward to hearing from you. Thank you, Sarah.
Great, thank you. Let me go ahead and share my screen. All right. All right, are you all seeing the slides? Yes?
Yes.
All right. All right, so thank you for that introduction, Adam. My talk is entitled Deep Digitization, Tracing Object Biographies Through Digital Archival Methods. So just like typical academic, I'm going to start by reading out a poem that actually inspired some of this work. So it's from entitled The Age of Frivolity by Thomas Beck. And it goes, some spend a life in classing grubs or try new methods to impale a butterfly, or bottled up in spirits, keep with care a crowd of reptiles hideously rare, while others search the moldering wrecks of time and drags their stories from dust and rust and slime. Coins eat with canker, metals half defaced, and broken tablets never to be traced. Worm-eaten trinkets thrown away of old, and broken pipkins formed in antique mold. Huge limbless statues, busts of heads forgot, and paintings representing none knows what. Strange legends that to monstrous fables lead, and manuscripts that nobody can read. The shapeless forms from savage hands that sprung, and fragments of rude art when art was young. This precious lumber labeled, shelved, and cased, and with the title of museum graced, shows how man may time and fortune waste and die a mummied connoisseur of taste. So in Assyriology, we often find broken tablets never to be traced. And when we talk about them, we end up with sort of something like this in articles. We have the then and the now. We have the tablets from, where they were found, where they were originally made, and then we skip a bunch and end up here, sort of where, just basic information about the tablet that ends up as sort of a simple entry in, the British Museum catalog or something like the CDLI. But really, there's a lot that happens in between these stages, stuff that we tend to ignore, but I think becomes very important when we talk about digitizing these tablets in different ways. So using a few different sort of theoretical methods that I'm exploring for the first time, I want to talk about adding object biographies to digital objects in a way that sort of fleshes them out. It's sort of well recognized in digital humanities that when we digitize an object, we are essentially creating a new digital object. However, this object lacks a lot of depth that the original object holds. And so we can sort of engage with these different ideas through, first of all, things like resonance, which sort of imagines the different ways that people come into contact with these objects and the different sort of ideas that stem from this. And so I have this quote at the top, all museums are a stage and all the artifacts merely players. They have their entrances and their exits, and one artifact in time plays many parts. So when we display an object, we don't always display it in the same ways. It's sort of well known by many in the museum field that when you have collections of objects, the reality is the vast majority of them only go on display really if they're lucky. Whereas the rest of these objects will sit in storage, usually available to researchers. And really the fact that these objects stay in this sort of way is something that we don't engage with a lot. Let's see. Sorry. It's now common practice to assert that objects can tell stories. The traces of history we uncover exemplify the concept of resonance, as proposed by Stephen Greenblatt. Resonance is the power of an object to reach beyond its formal boundaries to a larger world, to evoke in the viewer the complex, dynamic cultural forces from which it has emerged. In effect, collections have become time machines that permit us to view earlier periods of a world that no longer exists for us. If we are lucky, each of these entrances and exits that Ernst outlines for us leave behind traces that build their biographies, and we find those traces in object archives. To better understand the traces and remains left in archives, I find it useful to apply the idea of the contact zone from Mary Louise Pratt. Typically applied to museum objects, a contact zone refers to social spaces where cultures meet, clash, and even grapple with each other, often in contexts of highly asymmetrical relations of power, such as colonialism. The power dynamics of the outside world are reflected in what traces are left behind in each archive, in a process that begins even before we enter an archival space. And as researchers, we become entangled in a web of archival stories, irrespective of whether we do narrative analysis with the documents we find in archives. Derrida describes this in terms of a phantom version of the researcher left behind in the archive following contact. There are nothing but traces left in archive documents and collections. These traces raise a lot of what has been, forgotten, either, never recorded, misassigned, or even sometimes lost and destroyed. I think several of us may have had the experience of opening up a box of cuneiform to find a bag of dust, unfortunately. And the digital world provides the ability to keep track of this growing archive, but only if we commit to digitizing and naming the phantoms of the archive's past. Digitization is generally considered a democratizing force for collections, an important step toward improving access to historical objects and sources. Our traditional idea of the analog archive is sort of being replaced by this idea of a digital archive. While it is true that the digital archive cannot reproduce the entire physicality of an object or a record, we can add and manipulate information in order to tell a more complete, fuller story. Digital images, especially 3D models, are sort of seductive in today's research because they are seemingly more real than either transcriptions or photographs or documents. However, they are stripped from archival and historical context. I have argued that archival documents accompanying objects serve to tell a much more complete story of those objects' past. In the study of Assyriology, we have to deal with a particularly contentious past, especially one that many are reluctant to acknowledge. Telling an object's full story means telling the story of the colonialism that led the object into our collections in the first place. In the study of the ancient Near East specifically, many of the objects we study were legally removed from their context by American and European scholars in the 19th and 20th centuries. University and art museums in major American cities were desperate for these collections at a time when they wanted to show, the roots of civilization in the ancient Near East, be able to show examples of the first forms of writing. What was included in the collection and who created it sent clear messages about which groups belonged in the so-called Western tradition, and collection displays influenced how the origin of the objects and its place in the world were imagined. The overarching question at the heart of this issue of a colonial past is how we can sort of begin to even address it, especially from the point of view of a very Western institution. The simple answer is that a decolonizing practice must be in the service of sort of just speaking the hard truths. We can't undo what has been done, but we can talk about it in meaningful ways. Just as we do with physical objects themselves, when we engage with digital objects, we should begin with the core recognition that objects are living entities, embodying different layers of meaning deeply connected to the past. Whitelaw argues in favor of what he calls generous interfaces in the process of digitization. He employs this term in regard to search terms and online browsing of museum collections, but we can expand it to include other ways of enriching digital collections. In revealing the complexity of these collections through what I've been sort of calling for myself deep digitization, a generous interface would also enrich interpretation by revealing relationships and structures of power within a collection. And so how would this look in a seriology? Well, here's an example of an object from the collection of tablets in the John Hay Library at Brown University, which I had the privilege of spending quite a bit of time creating 3D models of before everything sort of shut down. So first, this is Museum Object 39, or M39 as it is called in our collections. It's a clay tablet inscribed with cuneiform. It's currently in the special collections at the John Hay Library. This tablet was written to record the harvest of dates in two gardeners' date palm orchards during the reign of Shusin around 2035 BCE. Shusin was the king of southern Mesopotamia and is known as the penultimate king of the famed Ur-3 dynasty. The Ur-3 period in particular is known for the just incredible number of Sumerian economic documents it produced. This tablet is just one of the tens of thousands we currently know to exist. The two gardeners are Ur-Ishkur and Undaga. The scribe of the tablet is not identified, but presumably they were charged with recording and calculating the total harvest. While they were correct in their calculations for the date produced by Ur-Ishkur, there is a discrepancy in his work for Undaga. This is the usual extent of information we are given in traditional Assyriological publication. However, there are thousands of years missing time between the tablet finding its way into the underground stratigraphy of Umma and its current location in Providence, Rhode Island. Sometime before the year 1942, this tablet came into the possession of Jesse H. Metcalf, a former United States Senator from Rhode Island. Part of a wealthy connoisseur's collection, M39 was likely purchased from a source that maybe should not have been in the possession of the tablet to begin with. At this time, it was not unusual for wealthy Americans to claim possession of cuneiform objects. As examples of the world's first writing, the wealthy sought to control these objects as a way of forming a connection to a manufactured, glorious intellectual past. Upon his death, Jesse Metcalf's wife, only referred to in records as Mrs. Jesse H. Metcalf, donated the tablet to Brown University Special Collections, where it now resides. A small piece of paper describes the tablet as such. At the time, Joka was thought, so it describes it as, from Joka, a remarkably perfect tablet. At the time, Joka was thought to be the modern day name for the ancient site of Umma. We now know this is incorrect and identify the site with the modern al-Aqarib, Iraq. Following an unspecified amount of time in special collections, M39 went on display, possibly for the first time. This is the first label that it was given to M39, but at some kind of display, it was then given this label. This label has substantially more information, and it includes that it was found that this is an inscription in cuneiform containing large numbers of signs indicating sheep and goats. We know now that this is not correct. The cuneiform, which is of a, quote, very ancient type, is probably a tax list dating from the time of Sargon of Akkad. Once again, we know that this is not correct. This was about 2750 BC. This tablet was found Joka in central Babylonia. And so this label tells us, you know, displaying this shows us a few different things. It shows us about the life of this object in terms of its collections, one of the many roles that it plays on the museum stage. But it also helps us acknowledge times when we've gotten things wrong. This happens a lot when we study the past. We uncover new information, we uncover new ways of thinking, but displaying times when we sort of, you know, messed it up, when we guessed incorrectly, can be can provide an equal amount of context as simply saying what we know now. Whoever was responsible for this label clearly aimed to update what came before, but with disappointing results. Due to the inaccuracy of the information, it would be easy to think that this label was erroneously left with the wrong object. However, someone has written M39 in pencil on this paper as well. So here we have two different people, two different phantoms of the archive. We have one person who created this label, presumably the person who was in charge of the display. And then we have someone else who has come through and made sure that this piece of archival document was matched to object M39. At this point, much of the early information I've provided for M39 comes from the penultimate entry into the archive of this tablet. You may have also noticed that I haven't yet mentioned a translation. There is no recorded translation until about 60 years after M39 entered special collection. In 2002, Professor Alice Slotsky, a visiting assistant professor of the history of mathematics, brought two of her students, Nicholas A. Kammer and Virginia Hudson Rimmer, better known to us in the field as Dr. Virginia Herman, of the Brown class of 2002, came to John Hay Library with the goal of translating some of the tablets in special collections. And the result is the first online archive entry pertaining to M39. And this is the page that we get from the John Hay Library website. However, this slide right here, someone has actually printed out some of the work from this website to make sure that it has a place in the rest of the paper archive for the object. And so M39 then stayed in storage for the better part of the next 17 years. It was taken out and handled by various students from a mixture of classes on the ancient Near East, but no further research appears to have been done until the summer of 2019, bringing us to me and when I started my work in making 3D models. And I promise that the 3D models have texture, they have color, but PowerPoint is just not great at displaying that, unfortunately. In the process of digitizing the collection of cuneiform objects and special collections, I created these 3D models and then researched and wrote the object biography that I'm now presenting. Object collections in the United States and Europe especially contain the stories of a difficult colonial past. Objects were collected from around the world by connoisseurs and researchers alike, often without regard for the people and places tied to the heritage of those objects. In some cases, we can get glimpses into this collecting past through the records that accompany an object. It is unfortunately commonplace to leave these records along with the colonial past that they represent in storage. And herein lies how we in the digital humanities can both add depth to the objects we digitize and tell the hard stories of Assyriology's past. It is clear that we lose some of the substance of an object when we digitize it. We create this new 3D object, but it becomes separated from the original object in a way that that original object was already separated from most of its object biography. In digitizing the object records along with an object itself, we can bring to light many of these sort of forgotten or ignored stories, the many roles that this object has played in its display. Are also just where it sits in its collections. Well, at the same time, we can start opening up some of the colonial baggage that these objects carry in the process of sort of decolonizing our fields, beginning the process of cleaning out old wounds. Like I said before, we cannot undo what has already been done, but we can start to acknowledge it and include it more in our research. So thank you all for listening. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Sarah. That was excellent. It was really fascinating to see the kind of behind the scenes of what goes on in a museum, and your experience there really shines a fascinating light into the kind of dusty corners of museum archival curation that I think most participants or visitors to a museum aren't ever privy to. We have a number of questions here, but I think I might start with one if I may. So yeah, I think there's kind of two things that you bring up that are really novel and fascinating to explore. And one of them is the kind of like along Latour's lines of like an actor network theory. That these objects, as you said, are alive. They're actors. They're like kind of they have an impact and an impression on us when we visit them, even if they are the static object that sometimes disintegrates in a shelf. And I think that there's a number of questions about that I've received already. I can tell about access and how we have kind of varying degrees of access to these objects. It's one thing that kind of elevates their value on the black market. It's why these collectors had them initially, right? There was some kind of prestige and value associated with these objects. And I think that as we're kind of thinking about the concepts that you brought up here, I wonder how you envision the access to these objects from these different kind of degrees. Those who are working, as you did in the museum, and those who are at home, perhaps now only able to view them online. Museums in the past have inherently, intentionally limited the audience from looking at the archival records because they're maybe embarrassing for a museum to see that, oh, this was procured after 1930 when it shouldn't have been. For example, there's many museums that fall into that scenario after Gertrude Bell arranged the whole agreements between excavations in the Middle East and the procurement of those artifacts or the ability to bring them to the States or in other countries. It still happens, of course, but I think that the question, I guess, is, how does the digitization methods, these new technologies, how should we mitigate that at these different audiences? Those who are in charge of working, and curating a digital data set, and those who are more like visitors from the outside. Should it just be all open and everyone can kind of see the whole entirety of the records, or is there more of a story map or narrative that you should be guided through rather than able to say search everything all at once?
Yeah, so I guess I'm going to take the somewhat mixed answer of, I think both are really valuable. It's funny that you bring up story maps because as a part of this project, I've been building story maps for each of these objects because I've been thinking about ways for the public to access these stories. Because I think, yeah, some of it is really embarrassing, but we can't change what has been done. We can only move forward from that. And I think it adds a layer of accountability for a lot of these institutions, museums and universities alike, to share this information. It's both an acknowledgement, but also saying to the public, we're telling this story now because we think it's important to tell, but also, we don't want to do this again. And I think that's where a lot of institutions are sort of heading, saying we did this, but we're being very careful to not make it happen again. But I also think that a lot of times with public scholarship, because that's also one of my passions, we make the assumption that the public needs more hand-holding than they necessarily do, which is kind of just a little bit elitist, to be frank. And so I think having this just open search is also a necessary thing, letting the public decipher the story themselves, but also maybe they're only interested in sort of one section of this past.
Yeah, and I guess that leads to the next question that that's also resonated by those that I've received so far, and that is like, how do you imagine the platform to enable that kind of, right? Currently, A lot of museums have online catalogs that you can search, but they don't necessarily link these records that you've scanned to the objects themselves. You described it as metadata, which I think is kind of where a lot of museums are currently. If they do upload, say, a tablet to Sketchfab, then all of a sudden it's kind of cut off on Sketchfab from that metadata in the catalog record. So is there like a new platform that will be for museums, all museums to participate in, or is this more localized with every individual museum in your mind?
In my mind, and what I know of the platforms that are available, it does seem more localized. Even with something like story maps, I couldn't add a 3D model to it.
Yeah.
And like you said, Sketchfab is meant just for 3D models, but not necessarily for adding these photograph documents. Even these 3D models are in Brown's digital repository, but like most digital repositories, it categorizes things. And so the 3D models are in one place and the archival materials in another,
Yeah.
which, I find frustrating. And, it's a great question because, I really hope there is some kind of platform coming soon that would allow us to merge these a lot better, especially because I don't think artifacts are the only thing that are getting this sort of 3D photogrammetry treatment right now that could benefit from having the ability to include scanned or photographed documents alongside them.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. I mean, there are entire rooms that we're digitizing, entire environments, entire sites.
Yeah.
You talk about the context and how like contextualizing these objects in their narratives about the acquisition is important, but now we can actually contextualize these artifacts back to the very fine spots and loci that they came from. If you have, the terrain that you've scanned, digitized, that might happen in Unity or something like that, maybe.
Yeah, and I started this project with the idea of access in mind. I was just like, people should be able to know that these objects are here and be able to see them without having to travel to Rhode Island. But then, I had all these documents, all these models in separate online collections, and I was like, this is not better. This is still lack of access.
Yeah. One of the things that came up is the kind of priority of digitization. I mean, all of this is expensive, at least in terms of time, if not in terms of technology. I mean, making a 3D scan versus just using photogrammetry is far more expensive. Those devices cost $50,000 to begin with. And so that museum would have to rent them out or have a partnership with someone who has them. I mean, these things are expensive and time consuming. So the digitization of the artifact alone, is a challenge for most museums. But in addition to that, we think about the cost of OCRing, scanning and OCRing files from, filing cabinets and things where these are kept, hopefully, if you're lucky. Otherwise, they're in boxes, which is even harder. But I think that you make a compelling argument for the best practice here. We're talking about best practices, I think. And, if you go about scanning something like you've done, well, then a lot of museum is really about creating access to people who may have disabilities as well, who may be blind. And therefore, the descriptions that are written there have to be digital. So it's not enough to just scan a document or scan a tablet. You have to, provide some narrative like you were describing. Okay, so we have those kind of three things. We have the digitization of the object, the digitization and optical character recognition of any paper typed out documents, and then this narrative that you described. Like, at least in those three kind of categories, and each of those is a project unto themselves. What would be the priority for any given object?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in a time when, you walk into museums and you're not expected to be able to touch the object, because when I think of access for people with disabilities, I think, you can't see the object, you may want to touch it. you can see it, but maybe you can't hear the audio, right? And so you run into all these problems, and I think it sort of centers around telling the story, because they're in sort of museum best practices. You don't want to have this like giant 2 pages of label, right, like next to the object. That creates sort of a logjam in a lot of different ways, and it also just sort of takes away from the power and the wonder that you might experience walking into an exhibit. But actually, it's interesting that you brought this up, because the very first tablet that I made a scan of actually belongs to the Hafenreffer Museum at Brown, because they wanted to experiment with ways to 3D print objects that might allow people who have visual disabilities to touch things and sort of get a sense of the object that way. Also, just help museums deal with the ever-present kid issue. When you have children that come in, they want to touch things, and it's frustrating for them and for parents when they can't. But that also brings up, the issue of how you tell that story, because how are you speaking to an adult and a child and a teenager, all in the same sort of abbreviated text that's meant to tell thousands of years of history.
Yeah, absolutely. I like at least how you talk about these different modalities, that there's like the audio there that maybe people could play, at a higher, for higher level engagement. And it's a long story about the acquisition process and all of this, that's told in a captivating narrative. I mean, it just opens up a lot of opportunities, I think, for providing that archival context, as well as the history of the object itself. And I think the other thing that you brought up with that's interesting, and worth kind of mentioning at least, is that we have like a whole network of people who've been involved in the curation process who are usually not mentioned, at all. Like these are people who are very often students, who are working with the museum. They are staff who may be really fastidious in their notes, but not mentioned anywhere. And it kind of speaks to a shift that's taking place with publication efforts, I think, that you rightly bring to attention. Would you say that it's time for museums to go back and include the register of people who've worked on these objects in some form and include them in some way? Or where do you imagine that would be, in the metadata of an object? Or
Yeah, I mean, I would love to see that in the metadata of an object, especially in cases, like I mentioned, where you have these documents and someone has gone through and written in pencil. I'm just like, who was that? Who was the last person to do this? One is, as scholars, it prevents us from duplicating work, and also sort of prevents us from falling into that narrative of, discovered in the archives, because the archivist knows it's there. It's us who don't regularly work in the archives that feel like we found it for the first time. But also a lot of times the people that have gone through and have done this work are the people that don't get their names on publications. They're the people who don't have those high profile positions. And I think that's another thing that, sort of not quite fits into the decolonization model, but sort of fits into the labor acknowledgement model, just showing all the different people who have brought this object into its different roles, and all those people who've, incidentally helped this object survive. I mean, I made the comment of, finding a bag of dust kind of as like a general comment, but that's actually what happened when I opened up one of these boxes. And it was kind of like, well, maybe the last person who touched this was in the 1940s, and that's why it looks like this. And those are things that, I personally would very much want to know.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for giving us this great talk and an interesting vantage point into the kind of digital curation process. Great. So our next speaker is Heidi Hilliker from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. And she is a PhD student from Michigan. Her research interests include ancient Egyptian textiles, craft production, economics, and gendered labor. Specifically, she's interested in examining the economic structures and gendered labor guiding the textile industry to achieve a greater understanding of the relationship between bureaucratic oversight and independent producers. Very exciting. So we look forward to hearing your talk today. Thank you, Heidi.
Thank you. Okay, can you all see my slides?
Yes.
Excellent. So hello and thank you for joining me today. As Adam said, I'm an Egyptologist with an interest in textile production. As I will discuss in my presentation today, the University of Michigan has a robust collection of textiles and related materials from the Egyptian site of Karanis. After matriculating into the university, I was extremely interested in what this evidence could tell us about the lives of craftspeople, specifically textile makers and specialists, and their economic and social concerns. Today, I will share with you my observations regarding village-level textile economies through an analysis of craft training at Karanis, explicitly looking at evidence for formal apprenticeship and informal learning. I will start by briefly introducing Karanis and the University of Michigan collections. Karanis is a village in the Egyptian Fayum that was founded during the reign of King Ptolemy II. This settlement was active from the Ptolemaic period through the Byzantine period, with its largest population existing under Roman rule in the latter half of the 3rd century CE. Agriculture provided the backbone of Karanis's economy, as it was a source of grain for the larger Roman Empire. While agriculture was the primary industry of the village, various other occupations, including textile production, are preserved in the textual and archaeological record. In the early 20th century, the University of Michigan participated in several excavations of the site, which uncovered a variety of evidence relevant to the study of village-level textile production in a Roman province. An assortment of textile artifacts with provenience, as well as papyri documents, were accessioned into the University of Michigan's Kelsey Museum of Archaeology and Papyrology collection. This evidence provides insight into social and economic structures of village-level textile production at Roman Karanis. When the university began excavations in 1924, the only textiles that were found were discarded scraps which had been thrown into refuse heaps in the streets and courtyards. The textiles in the collection are all fragmentary, totaling roughly 3,500 pieces. The fragmentary nature of the textile remains, along with their deposition, make it difficult to use them to recreate textile production in the village. However, the quality and the diversity of these remains reveal the resources, technology, and skill required of producers and demanded by consumers. In addition to the textile fragments, a collection of textile working tools were accessioned into the Kelsey Museum. Over 900 textile tools or tool fragments were excavated and recorded, and about 165 made it into the museum's collection. These tools include complete spindles, spindle whorls, spindle shafts, weaver's combs, heddle jacks, pins, needles, loom weights, and much more. The University of Michigan Library is home to the largest collection of ancient papyri in North America, although I'm sure some of you at UC Berkeley may beg to differ. The documents in the papyrology collection span roughly 2,000 years and contain religious texts, personal letters, school primers, sales contracts, and other records that paint a unique portrait of everyday life. Studying both the archaeological and textual evidence will serve as the basis for my discussion of the textile industry at Karanis. But how can we use them to explore organization of production and apprenticeship? A cursory glance at textile chaîne operatoire or series of production, sequence of production, reveals that many individuals representing various levels of training and skill were integral to the earlier stages of material procurement and preparation. So for example, raising sheep, shearing sheep, and then processing the wool fiber. When it comes to primary and secondary production, so the creation of strands or yarn and the formation of fabrics, a specific level of knowledge and skill is and was required. This is certainly true for those producing only for subsistence, but becomes essential for those who are both full and part-time specialists. A specialist can broadly be defined as a person who produces more of some good or service than he or she personally uses. And they are able to exploit surplus products for additional income, whether subsistence or wealth. For this talk, I'm going to refer to full-time specialists as professionals. In thinking about the textile economy of Karanis, it is helpful to understand the process of becoming both a part-time specialist and a full-time professional, and how this financially impacted an individual craftsperson and their family. To examine these ideas further, I will look at craft production as a profession through the lens of apprenticeship. I will do this first by addressing two theoretical frameworks for apprenticeship. Then I will compare these concepts with textual and archaeological evidence related to Roman Karanis. In a 2012 publication, Vilica Vendrick outlines an archaeological approach towards the study of apprenticeship rooted in anthropological theory. Many of the terms and concepts described by Vendrick can be applied to this discussion of Karanis and apprenticeship at Karanis. Firstly, she defines apprenticeship as the transmission of culture through a formal or informal teacher-pupil relation as individuals or groups. The most relevant aspects of Vendrick's approach from my current study are the types of knowledge and the transmission of knowledge through learning. Knowledge can include the acquisition of several elements, including the understanding of tools, gestures, production sequence, the vocabulary to discuss the craft, and knowledge of materials. Body knowledge is a term initially coined by Vendrick in 2006, which refers to the mastery of dexterity, skill, and endurance. This can be understood as kinesthetic knowledge, and I will employ this later on in the presentation today. The types of knowledge outlined above must then be transmitted through the apprenticeship process of learning. Learning can be achieved by play, observation, imitation, performance of menial tasks, initiation, copying, repetitive practice, and increased responsibility, freedom, and experimentation. Vendrick explains that these processes all take time but can range in organization from highly structured with a specific curriculum to more informal learning by example. This may be determined by the master-pupil relationship, which has various forms: master-pupil, parent-child, between group members, and even from oral traditions. It is useful to consider who is teaching when it comes to textile work in Karanis, because it may lead to a greater understanding of the process, as well as how these skills were valued by and operated in society. This is also something to consider when asking why an individual learns. Vendrick argues that, at the very minimum, the objective of learning includes some degree of enculturation. However, the objectives of learning can almost certainly include economic goals in addition to social aims. And there has been some discussion of these objectives in classical scholarship. Christoph Freud's analysis of apprenticeship in the Roman world explicitly addresses the social and economic benefits of professional training. Through an analysis of textual sources, including papyri from Roman Egypt, Freud argues that apprenticeship offers three distinct advantages to apprentices: disciplina, patrocinium, and nomen, which can be translated as the teaching of skills, patronage, and fame. Freud takes these idealized terms and creates a framework for evaluating actual benefits. At the core of her argument is a system of training with the objective of financial security and economic prospect of upward mobility. One of the most relevant observations that Freud shares is that in Roman Egypt, many craftsmen families wanted to place their children outside of the family. Freud suggests that this demonstrates that training practices were not secret to individual masters, but shared by professional circles, that this could contribute to improving techniques. If Freud's idea is correct, this would demonstrate an organized system for professional and technical development toward economic advantage. Repeated transmission of skills over time can create lineages of craft specialists and matching lineages of value. These advantages, Freud argues, tell us that the economic benefits could be expected from training. Looking closely at Freud's framework reveals many parallels between it and the approach outlined by Vendrick. Using their concepts as a foundation for examining textual and archaeological evidence related to Roman Koranis, I posit that there were two types of apprenticeships when it came to textile production. The first type of training that I've identified is formal learning. As I will demonstrate, formal learning is socially visible through apprenticeship contracts, letters, and tax documents, and appears to be associated primarily with secondary production, that is weaving. I will draw on both Vendrick and Freud's work in my analysis of this evidence. The other type of learning is informal training. I argue that this is the main form of training for primary production, spinning, but it can also be a method for learning to weave. It is quite invisible in textual sources because it is often done within the family as part of domestic education. For this, I will mostly draw on Vendrick's work. I argue that both forms of training have an economic objective, at least in part. The University of Michigan Papyrology collection contains several examples of textual evidence regarding weaving apprenticeship at Koranis and in the larger and greater Fayum area. From the available evidence, I have selected 3 documents that represent the complex system of formal training. The first is an apprenticeship contract from Koranis, and the second 2 are apprenticeship registration letters from nearby Oxyrhynchus. Apprenticeship contracts were not uncommon in Roman Egypt, and there are at least 30 known from various professions, including weaving. One very detailed contract in the university's collection is presented here. It represents a letter from Aurelius Isian, a resident of Koranis, in which he arranges a formal agreement with a female weaver named Aurelia, who lives in nearby Arsinoe, to educate his unnamed enslaved girl in the art of weaving. The terms of the apprenticeship are clearly demarcated in that it will be for a period of 1 year, and as many days as she is idle because of sickness or any other cause, she is to remain available an equal number of days as compensation after the end of the period. Not only is this time strictly set, but the learning goals are specified. The child will have completed this year of training after she has learned the craft with skill equal to those of her own age. The document also gives us some insight into the gender division of labor. The fact that Isian was training with a female weaver of sufficient skill to train an apprentice indicates that female weavers were indeed considered craft specialists and likely worked full-time. There's also another document in the papyrology collection which mentions a girl apprentice weaver. And I will briefly mention here that there has been some debate about this translation of slave girl in this document, and an alternate interpretation of this is that it was actually Isian's niece, and who was a freeborn girl who was the apprentice mentioned here. Additionally, the papyrus implies that textile training was a good financial investment for Isian to make. This contract even has extremely high financial stakes, as it includes a 200 silver drachmas penalty if either were to break the agreement. This is a significant risk for either party, as it reveals both the defined structure of the apprenticeships as well as their value. Freud supports this by saying that apprenticeships, when it was formally guaranteed by a contract, was thought to be an essential element of qualification and social promotion inside the hierarchy of craft. Sorry about that. We also see the value of training in 2 registration letters for tax purposes. These letters exemplify Freud's observation that craftspeople would often place their own children as apprentices in the homes of other craftspeople. In the first letter, we see a man named Pausiris places his young son Ammonius as an apprentice to the weaver Apollonius. We discover in the second letter, which was written at a later time, that Pausiris himself was also a master weaver. In the second letter, a woman named Helen places her young nephew as an apprentice with Pausiris. This certainly bolsters Freud's conclusion that formal apprenticeship structures with benefits implies the social and economic possibility of upward mobility and an economic emphasis on skilled versus unskilled labor. The structure of formal training demonstrates that the objective of learning for specialist weavers in Roman Egypt was not only a method of enculturation or a necessary process to gain household subsistence, it was also a profitable profession connected to an extra household economy with market exchanges. The textual evidence is useful when examining formal, visible learning, but it does not explicitly tell us much about informal training. For that, we need to look at the archaeological record and to Vendrick's work on archaeology of apprenticeship. There are a few methods for approaching this from a standpoint of material culture. One method is through the examination of the material records, specifically looking at objects that suggest learning and developmental behavior. Textile tools are one such class of object. Understanding how specific tools operated with the body and identifying what type of space or environment was needed to perform the necessary actions can tell us about the master-pupil relationship and the necessary properties of knowledge. An understanding of Chenapetoire and Vilica Vendrick's body knowledge is essential in analyzing tools. In researching textile tools from Karanis, now housed in the Kelsey Museum, I came across two objects in the collection database that may indicate the practice of informal household training. They are both miniature textile tools, which have been interpreted as toys. The first is a miniature spindle and a whirl, and the second is a toy weaver's comb. Both were found in units as part of domestic areas, which suggests that these miniature tools were used in homes. Perhaps, as I argue, they may represent evidence of household training. As Vendrick notes, knowledge can be transferred through play, observation, imitation, repetition, and experimentation. It seems that this class of toy would be perfectly suited for learning the basic movements and gestures associated with spinning and weaving, and could serve as important foundational knowledge for both future part-time specialists and full-time professionals. Furthermore, scholars in the fields of psychology and early childhood education have long discussed the developmental functions and socially embedded nature of play. Borrowing from the vocabulary of these fields, the textile tool toys from Karanis could be used in practicing thematic play. Thematic play or role play has recently been defined by Pumpert and Dober in an essay on developmental education. For them, this type of play is an imitation of a cultural activity such as the bakery, the restaurant, the garage, or the garden center. The children learn by taking up roles within cultural practices and enriching these. Every role is associated with specific needs and demands, specific qualities, knowledge, skills, and tools. The discussion of toys and miniatures as modes of learning extends to archaeological and anthropological literature. In fact, the use of toys and play as socialization practices at Karanis has been discussed by Karen Johnson in her 2007 PhD dissertation. Coming from the perspective that play is social in its origin, we can infer by the presence of these textile tool toys that craft was important to the community at Karanis. These may further suggest that the economic and cultural importance assigned to learning spinning and weaving through informal training, and, at least in the case of weaving, further training through formal apprenticeships. Some conclusions. A long-held interpretation of ancient Mediterranean economies was originated by Moses Findlay, who has advocated for a substantivist model, a socially embedded ancient economy motivated by internal social factors instead of external financial factors. A substantivist view suggests that elites engage in economic practices for social and political capital, while the economic practices of rural life were centered on household subsistence and self-sufficiency. Although there has not been a dedicated economic study done on Roman Karanis, this substantivist view seems to have been applied to a brief exploration of the settlement's rural economy by Andrea Berlin in 2004. She writes that the people of Karanis lived within a world of self-sufficiency concerned largely with providing for their own basic needs. She goes on to explain that the excavated documents and archaeological material provide a vivid picture of life in a subsistence economy. However, a preliminary examination of the available textual and archaeological evidence at the University of Michigan problematizes a purely subsistence structure to textile production in Karanis by revealing the existence of a market economy that interacted with individuals at all levels of society. I argue that individual laborers, producers, and consumers had an awareness of their financial world. They made intentional and efficient decisions to improve their economic situation. The textile profession and apprenticeships show the social and economic value of weaving and the potential for economic advancement through a process of formal training. Informal training does not come with the same prestige, but it is essential to support village-level textile production. This study has looked at craft production as a profession through the lens of apprenticeship. I argue that the investment into learning and building communities of practice demonstrates that Karanis had a complex village-level textile industry that supported both subsistence and a market economy. Lastly, this type of study demonstrates the continued relevance of analyzing museum and library collections through different perspectives and approaches. Thank you.
Thank you. What a fascinating exploration into the textile production of Karanis. Thank you so much for sharing this. Have you been able to visit the site yourself, or have you been there to check it out, the textile production there?
I have not been to Karanis. I was supposed to go when I was in my undergrad at UCLA, and there was a security issue that season. So I was unable to go, but I've spent a lot of time in the Kelsey and have been able to look at the textile remains and the tools firsthand.
Nice. Yeah, I guess that's one of the questions I've had. I mean, I work mostly in the Middle East, and I noticed that as people describe the textile production in, say, Mesopotamia, it's always a kind of, there's a distance there that we're intuiting a lot of things. And it isn't until we see a living culture, that's producing textiles on a loom, or they have that I think these connections start taking place. And that's been really transformative for our field, seriology. So I think that one of the things that really stood out to me in this was this distinction that you make between formal and informal craft production in terms of the technology. And the apprenticeship model is fascinating, and you give us some examples from the classical world. And I think one of my questions has to do with that formal model and the social mobility that it might provide. For example, in these 3 stages of the Roman apprenticeship model, the third was fame. I mean, it's presumably that someone could rise high enough in the model to enter the royal court, let's say. And we know that's true for, say, someone like a singer, but would that be the case, for the textile producers who are then maybe elevated to the role, if they're good enough, of making textiles for the royal family?
That's a great question. So when Freud created this model, she took it from Cicero. And when Cicero was speaking about this, he was using it primarily to talk about artists, fine artists and artist apprenticeships. So that level of fame that might translate into elite society in that circumstance might not directly map onto textile production or everyday crafts in the same kind of way. So while it's a great question, I'm not sure if I have a really perfect answer for that.
No, that's helpful, at least. The second one that I'll have, and then I'll open it up to others, is the informal model, which I'm personally more familiar with because in the field of, say, like Old Assyrian and Mesopotamian studies, the family model is dominant business model, and we see that the textile production is an enterprise guided and really managed almost exclusively by the women, the wives of the community and the city-state of Ashur. And so I think is like, the only way to really address that, of course, is archaeologically, to say like, okay, so as we see in private houses, we find a number of loom weights that would indicate to us that there's a high proportion of people who are weaving at home. In the case that you showed us an example of some objects that were designated as toys, you know, I think that could, if there's enough evidence of this kind of thing, it would obviously speak to a kind of, the proportion of, or at least the distribution of labor as it extends to children. And, and like, you know, the gamification of weaving could obviously be also seen as the exploitation of child labor, which is, you know, I mean, kind of common in the world if we're being honest with ourselves. And I think you touch on that, and it's really tantalizing. But do you have any?
Oh, Adam, I'm losing you a little bit.
Sorry, can you hear me? Okay.
Oh, yeah, you're back. Yep.
You touch on that kind of this artifact, but do we have a sense of from the archaeology to what degree we can estimate that this informal model was happening in proportion to the formal one, like say 60-40, you know, 60% informal textile production, 40% informal, or sorry, formal apprenticeship model?
Yeah, that is an excellent question. I don't know if I can put a ratio on it. So most of my work has been looking at pharaonic Egypt and pharaonic textiles, where we don't really get the same level of, well, we don't really get apprenticeship contracts. So we don't really have this evidence for formal training. So looking at those time periods, the assumption is that it is happening informally. And it appears that the way it's organized in the pharaonic period is that it's through dispersed labor happening in domestic settings, which would be a perfect area for informal learning. As far as other archaeologists have looked for child labor in other areas of the world as well, and specifically learning. There's been some work done looking at finished products. So there's been a study done in the Aegean with pottery, specifically looking at using both fingerprints to gauge hand size, and also looking at more rudimentary decoration and formation processes. I can actually show you this. To get a little bit, so these are the ones that were in this one study. So she was looking at painting, showing the development of learning these motifs, and also learning the design. So indicating that might be one way to learn. And there has been also some anthropological work looking at specifically at toys in living societies. So there is definitely a discussion and some precedent for thinking about informal learning happening in domestic settings and in households. And something I didn't really get into in this presentation, but from some of the textual evidence that we have from Karanis and the larger Fayum, there are some letters that are written by women. And there's an excellent article on this talking about invisible spinners that was published by Sophie Galino. And in these letters, she reveals that there were some women who were spinning at home for profit, and discussing it almost as just like as a supplementary income. So I think that would even further support that those women were likely learning informally at home. So there's multiple, I think, ways that we can approach informal learning if we're lucky to have textual evidence, but also in archaeology and in anthropological literature.
Thank you. Okay, so we have a question here by Jason Silvestri. Very interesting talk, Heidi. I'm curious to hear if there is an extant Thematic language documentation for textile production in the Fayum region that would confirm your model for textile production as an anthropological process.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Jason. So of the papyrology collection at the University of Michigan, there are hundreds of pieces that have not been translated. And that includes both in Greek and Demotic. So there may be some gems that are just waiting to come to the surface. I have not seen anything in the last year or so that I've been working on this project, specifically in the Demotic language. But I believe that there probably is something out there, specifically other kinds of contracts or letters.
Awesome. Thank you. And yeah, I think that is everything. So thank you for your excellent talk, and we will look forward to reading more about that in the future.
Thank you so much.
All right. Our next speaker is Gabriela Lichtbau from the University of Toronto. She obtained her bachelor's from the University of Toronto in social cultural anthropology and ancient Near East civilizations, with a focus on ancient Egypt, religion, and gender studies. More recently, she obtained her master's from the University of Toronto in Egyptology and archaeology, with a research focus on the body as ritual actor in the opening of the mouth ceremony as a means of examining the body through the lens of object agency in ancient Egyptian mortuary ritual. Her current research interests involve conceptions of the body in Egyptian thought and the expanded use of digital tools to engage with archaeological materials. She'll be speaking to us today on the use of body as an expression of self, a question of masculinity in the tale of two brothers. And we thank you for coming and turn the time over to you now.
Thank you. Well, today I'll be discussing conceptions of the body and the self in ancient Egyptian thought as they are represented in textual sources. More specifically, I'll be tackling the concept of the body through the lens of gender, examining how notions of gender are actualized using the body to express the self. The focus of my analysis being the late Egyptian text, The Tale of Two Brothers. In my presentation, I'll suggest that ancient Egyptian notions of gender were far more complex than a simple binary system allows, and were dependent on context and environment. I will also demonstrate that the body acts as the focal point of the expression of this phenomenon and its many forms. The Tale of Two Brothers is a late Egyptian tale written in hieratic and is found on the recto side of Papyrus D'Orbigny, currently being held at the British Museum. It was composed by the scribe Inanna during Dynasty 19, while Seti II was still crown prince. Over the last century, this text has been studied by Egyptologists in relation to its allusions to mythological principles and thematic parallels to tales attested in other civilizations. This previous analysis has generally emphasized the text categorization as either a folk tale, myth, or literature, but this focus often neglects the value of the text as a product of its own cultural context, anachronistically projecting modern notions of literature onto the ancient text. Rather than historicizing this text, identifying its genre, or identifying its Near East provenance, I'll be talking specifically about its mythological and literary elements that relate to how social conceptions of the body and gender were constructed and represented in the Egyptian context. The tale follows the journey of Bata, a man who has been wrongfully accused as a seducer and abuser by his brother's wife, and as a result flees from Egypt, only to continuously experience acts of betrayal by those closest to him. He eventually finds justice, and his story ends on a positive note with his ascent to kingship. My discussion will focus specifically on the initial act of betrayal and Bata's response. To illustrate how the body is used and represented in this text, I'll begin by discussing how the use of language in this passage reflects social notions of gender, by deconstructing the ideas inherent in the language used to describe Bata's character and body. My analysis focuses specifically on the event of Bata's act of self-penile castration, where I attempt to understand the potential motivations behind this seemingly exaggerated response. I will examine and place this action within the context of ancient Egyptian religious and mythological thought to demonstrate the central role that the body plays as a mode through which multifaceted notions of gender are navigated and represented, and how the act of self-penile castration relates back to notions of gender through religious and mythological metaphor. This tale suggests that the ancient Egyptians had a far more nuanced understanding of gender that was not limited to physical or biological aspects of the body, but was also influenced by its action and how it was used. The theoretical framework I used to frame Bata's various expressions of gender stem from the work of Judith Butler's Gender Trouble, where she introduces the notion of gender performativity, which understands gender as a performed action as opposed to being strictly biologically defined. This framework establishes a distinction between perceived gender and physical gender, one being socially determined and the other biological. We first see the body being central to establish and qualify an individual's character in the way Bata is introduced. It's here that we're also introduced to the notion of gender being rooted in performance, when the narrative elaborates on his actions, physical ability as a means of qualifying his character. The actions described highlight how Bata's physical body is used. He makes clothes, he goes after the cattle, he did the plowing, he does all the work in the field. These are all very physical actions that trigger an imagery of bodily movement and use. This in turn emphasizes physicality in how we come to understand Bata and the part he plays in the household, making the body central. Another point that's emphasized is Bata's social position within the household as the figurative son in relation to his brother Anubis and Anubis's wife. This characterization of Bata effectively bridges his personality with his physicality and his social status. Finally, the passage concludes with a summation of Bata's character and all these qualities he possesses in the form of a single word, ahauti, which is translated to be male or man, the significance of which I will address later in this presentation. The emphasis here is that Bata's character is qualified by his physical capabilities, how his body is used, and in how that use is perceived by others within the household, the narration, and by the audience. The first time we see the narrative play with notions of gender is in Bata's interaction with Anubis's wife. His elder brother sends him back to the household to fetch seed for sowing. When he gets there, he asks Anubis's wife for assistance, but she refuses and dismisses him. So he goes to gather the materials and prepares to return to the fields. But when he single-handedly bears the full load of all his materials, she begins to pay attention to him and attempts to seduce him. And this is the text that is presented on the slide before you. I would suggest that in demonstrating his strength by being able to actively in being able to carry the total of 5 sacks of seed, Bata's body experiences a transformation in the way that he is perceived. This transformation occurs at multiple levels. First, from boy to man, in reference to the social hierarchy imposed by the kinship structure, and secondly, from male to ahauti. The distinction between the two being that one transformation is in social status and the second is in perceived gender performance. It's important to note that this transformation occurs on an abstract plane of thought, as opposed to being a physical transformation of Bata's body. He doesn't physically change, but his social position does. This is made clear when he refuses her advances, citing and thereby attempting to reinstate the social order and claiming that she is like his mother, while her husband and Bata's brother is like his father. This transformation occurring on a conceptual plane in perception is further alluded to by the terminology used in the narration. Before his interaction with Anubis's wife, line 3.2, and after line 3.8, Bata is referred to as an ajid, meaning youth or boy. But when the narration expresses her point of view, Bata is likened to an ahauti. This signifies a masculinization of his self, achieved through his actions and performance of masculine behavior. This indicates a distinction between the male body and notions of masculinity, which suggests that the way the ancient Egyptians conceived of the physical body and gender may have been conceptually distinct, bearing one biologically derived concept and one socially derived. In assuming a masculinized state through the physical use of his body and the performance of masculine behavior, Bata's transformation from boy to ahauti undermines the status quo of the household. Even though this transformation is just in perception, it still has the power to incite chaos and instability in the household unit. The distinction between biological gender and a performed gender is also reflected in the form of the word man that denotes Bhatta's metaphysical transformation. Rather than refer to Bhatta as Chai, he is referred to as Ahauti. Both terms are unanimously translated by scholars to mean male. However, they have different connotations of use. Whereas Chai indicates a reference to a general maleness, Ahauti gives more a sense of gender behavior relating to a warrior-like action. This term highlights the aggressive and combative nature of masculinity and implies a very specific emphasis on aggressive action when referring to maleness. In this text, the verb is found as an active participle, which literally translates as one who fights, but it's consistently translated by scholars to be man. This gender designation reflects scholarship's dismissive attitudes towards non-biological notions of gender, resulting in what I believe to be, in this case, an overly simplistic translation. This connotative difference is evident in the determinatives used for the words, which at times function as classifiers, providing the reader with a range of information, some of which can involve gender and social status. This information is culturally specific and implicit in the form the determinative takes, so the ancient reader would have understood how these two terms were distinct. The determinative for Chai is the sign for the phallus, which indicates an association with biological sex as it relates to physiology. On the other hand, Ahauti is written with the man striking with a stick, indicating a connotative emphasis on action, and more specifically, physical aggression. This suggests that the use of this word wasn't meant to convey man or a strict biological sense of gender, rather a more complex expression rooted in action and behavior, or performance. In other words, Ahauti designates a socially constructed notion specifically defined by behavior and action, that of the warrior or fighter. Therefore, through Bhatta's actions, he experiences a social transformation in the perception of his gender through his masculinization, which is triggered by his performance of gendered behavior. This connotative value of the term Ahauti as an aggressive, dominant characterization of man is also noted in the contendings of Horus and Seth, another late Egyptian text. When Horus and Seth approach the gods for judgment, on which of them is the legitimate successor to the throne, Seth accuses Horus of having let Seth penetrate him, and uses this as justification to be appointed ruler. The purpose of this is to demonstrate that Seth is more qualified to rule because he's stronger and dominant. This is the passage on the slide. This passage on the slide is an excerpt from this text in which Seth describes his act. Seth refers to having done kat ahauti, the work of man, indicating that he is referring to himself as having performed a gendered action associated with maleness. The surface level meaning is that Seth uses his sexual role of the man to emphasize his strength and dominance. However, this is just one level of interpretation. Another stems from the choice to use the word kat ahauti to describe his sexual role. Firstly, we see here that ahauti is being used to refer to a character's gender, and it is again in the context of an action. Once more, the word is translated by scholarship to be man. Richard Parkinson notes the potential for the word to refer to warrior, but argues that it doesn't quite suit this context of use. While I agree that warrior doesn't make sense in this translation, I would argue that given the connotative specificity provided by the use of the word and its determinative, warrior as a form of masculine behavior and action is the idea that is meant to be conveyed and is very well suited to this context. The conception of masculinity that is being referred to in both these texts cannot be encapsulated by just the term man, because this is too general a translation and it really loses the level of meaning and significance. Rather, I'm suggesting that in both cases, ahauti is referring specifically to a warrior man, a gendered behavior that is expressed through the performance of a specifically gendered action. This word choice and the specificity of its translation are vital to better encapsulate a more accurate understanding of ancient Egyptians' conception of gender. Through the language used to describe Bhatta and his situation, I've demonstrated the potential for a more nuanced understanding of gender in Egyptian thought. However, nowhere in the story is this connection between action and the body in relation to gender more evident than in the event of his castration. It is in this scene that the idea of biological gender and social conceptions of gender come head to head. When he returns home from the field, Anubis finds his wife beaten and ill. When he asks her what happened, she accuses Bata of having attacked her after he failed to seduce her. Anubis then attempts to kill his brother until the creator god Preharakti intervenes by separating the two with a river of crocodiles. With a physical barrier between them, Bata confronts his brother and explains what really happens, and this sets the scene for the translation you see on the slide. Bata's response to his brother's injustice act is to physically mutilate his own body. He grabs a knife and cuts off his phallus. This action is never explained in the text, but I think if we look at its mythological significance and its relationship to gender, we can begin to understand Bata's action. A few ideas have been suggested to explain why Bata responds in this manner. One idea understands Bata's actions within a legal context. Scholars have suggested that Bata's act of self-mutilation was a declaration of his innocence. This is based on David Lordan's examination of legal texts in the New Kingdom period, which demonstrate that bodily mutilation had become a common element of enacting justice. Individuals being interrogated had to take an oath accepting bodily mutilation as a form of punishment for perjury. This is evident from the judicial papyrus of Turin, which describes how those involved in the harem conspiracy against Ramses III were punished for their actions. The idea being that since they accepted the consequences, they must be telling the truth. But Bata takes this to the next level by not only accepting the consequences, but actively executing them. The one-sided nature of the dialogue between him and his brother and the confrontation aspect also acts to reinforce the judicial nature of the scene. However, while the act of self-mutilation may figuratively represent his innocence, this explanation doesn't really account for the symbolic depth of his action. Even after being protected by divine intervention, presenting and defending his case, Bata still takes this extreme action. So how can we go about understanding the rationale behind it? I suggest a more suitable explanation is rooted in Egyptian mortuary and cosmological thought. I believe that the religious and funerary context is better suited to understand the significance of penile castration as a form of bodily mutilation enacted by Bata. Its mythological implications also facilitate a deeper understanding of the reasoning behind this action. Much of the Egyptians' notions of death and the afterlife is rooted in the Assyrian mythology, in which the god Osiris is killed and dismembered by his brother Seth, who seeks to claim his throne. He is then restored and reanimated by his wife Isis. Osiris's reanimation is central to his divinity, but his death and dismemberment are just as important when it comes to mortuary thought. It's through this allegory that death and bodily mutilation were viewed as necessary to life. While bodily mutilation may initially seem like a contradiction to the values of unity that are an integral part of Egyptian mortuary thought, it becomes a significant thematic tool through which religious thought is able to come to terms with the finality of death. Rather than being a traumatic end, death is understood to be a transformational experience that is necessary for life and to achieve restoration of the self. As an act of bodily mutilation, Bata's self-penile castration can therefore be interpreted as the catalyst for his transformation, much like death is a transformation of life. While this better explains the rationale behind the act, it still doesn't quite explain the significance of it. For that, we need to look at cosmological principles of thought. It's safe to say that the act of penile castration is intentional and specific. The fact that it's Bata's phallus that is removed is a significant detail in understanding the relevance of the act. One interpretation of the phallus's significance stems from its role in creation mythology, the creator god having made the cosmos from his semen following an act of masturbation. Because of this, it has symbolic associations to rebirth, regeneration, and masculine fertility. This association with masculine fertility also reflects a focus on masculinity as a performance of gender and power, as we see in the contendings of Horus and Seth, and is an association already recognized by much of scholarship. Richard Parkinson has tackled this issue in his own work as well. Bata's act of self-castration has generally been understood by scholarship as an act of emasculation. When he severs his phallus, he loses his ability to procreate, thereby separating himself from his masculine fertility. But this still doesn't answer the question of why Bata responds in this manner. I would suggest an alternative, that we take this act to be understood along the lines of performativity, as a separation from a performed maleness as opposed to a physical or biological one. Rather, through this act, Bata separates himself from a social construct of masculinity that is symbolically associated with the phallus and behavior related to power and domination. Now the question is, why would Bata choose to separate himself from this form of masculinity? This brings us back to the previous discussion of Ahauti, the aggressive form of masculinity performed by Bata in his physical use of the body within the household. Bata's characterization as an Ahauti is the point of origin for the dramatic events that ensue in the story, taking him away from his family and home. The negative events that follow Bata's actions as an Ahauti, and Seth for that matter, demonstrate that this form of masculinity has the potential to be destructive to social stability. The main issue that incites controversy between Bata and his brother is not in Bata's role as a male, as previous translations imply, but in his performance of this destructive warrior-like form of masculinity that undermines the social hierarchy inherent in Bata's social status as the Ajad. Therefore, rather than being taken as an act against masculinity or maleness in a general sense, the act of self-penile castration is an act against the form of masculinity conceptualized by the term Ahauti, which is by nature destructive. Bata physically dissociates from the actions that have been the cause of his suffering. Associations of castration to gender in this manner is also discussed by German scholar Wolfgang Wotango, who argues that this act is necessary as a necessary elimination of gender entirely to facilitate subsequent transformation from male to androgyny. He notes that the mutilation of genitals is not specific to the Osirian myth, but is an action also experienced by Re and Seth in their own mythology. Based on Re's experience and his ability as a creator god, Wotango suggests that castration actually functions as a transformation, allowing the divine to acquire creative ability. This association between androgyny and creation is also present in other creation myths, such as the Memphite theology. Therefore, the severing of the phallus doesn't necessarily act as a demonstration of innocence or biological emasculation, but can also be understood as an act to eliminate masculinity for transformative purposes in order to acquire those creative abilities. This mythical transformation into a new state of being best explains the events following Bata's castration and the magical direction that the story takes following his bodily restoration and rebirth. In the context of this story, this performed gender is by nature destructive. The solution is to separate himself from his performed masculinity through the act of self-penile castration, thereby dissociating himself from the contextually negative perception of masculine behavior. This triggers a transformation of the self, beginning with his death, physical dismemberment, and concluding with his physical restoration and rebirth. The Tale of Two Brothers presents an interesting study of notions of masculinity, suggesting a multiplicity of constructs depending on the context of its appearance. There's the physiological-based conception of gender. Then there's a performative-based conception of gender defined by action and behavior. Finally, there is an androgynous notion rooted in mythical and religious thought, which undermines the binary system as a whole, thereby maintaining that the ancient Egyptians did in fact have a more nuanced notion of gender and in how it was perceived. The body also plays a significant role in the events of this tale, not simply as a display of gender, but as a space in which it is symbolically navigated, expressed, and transformed. In the end, the Tale of Two Brothers can be viewed as a tale of morality and gender performance and the spaces in which they should be exercised.
Thank you, Gabriella. That was absolutely fascinating. I'd love to talk more about what some of the things that you bring up in this really interesting exploration of this text. I think as someone who's only kind of tendentially aware of ancient Egypt from Mesopotamian point of view, this is really fascinating because we rarely get texts that go, this intimate into the kind of demonstration of this boundary between, maleness and androgyny. I mean, I think that that's one thing that stands out about Egypt is very often even the pharaoh will be represented as androgynous to some degree. So I think that's a really interesting aspect that this explores, and I think it raised a question in my mind as we try to contextualize this text, and try to understand the definitions or the kind of context and essentially the way to think about an embodied ancient Egyptian and what that entails, whether it's male or female or something in between. What can we reach to aside from this text itself? Obviously Judith Butler's contemporary, she's postmodern. And if we were to try to understand sexuality in our own norms today, we'd have a really high chance of misunderstanding the ancients. I think we have a hard time understanding even what went on a century before now in terms of sexual norms and embodied experience. So kind of trying to get our minds in tune with how the text is portraying what kind of contexts were helpful for you as you framed that for the ancient kind of definition of personhood and an embodied person, whether it's gendered or not?
Right. It's a very good question. For me, what sort of grabbed my attention of the potential for this sort of this variation in how gender may be understood or represented was really predominantly in the use of the term ahouti. I kind of struggled with, in my research, sort of other scholars' attempts to translate it. It just seemed like it with the simple translation of man, it just didn't quite explain the character's response, and it didn't quite sit well in my mind as a full explanation. And there's this point after the later in the text, once Bata is restored and goes through sort of this kind of allusion to a rebirth, the tale tends to take the tale takes a very sort of more magical and sort of figurative approach. It's a lot of strange occurrences occur. So is this also this parallel with the androgyny creative ability? So, and seeing that in creation mythology and sort of wondering if there was a connection between the two, and that might be the illusions that are the intention of the act of castration. So it was just sort of these main principal elements that sort of led me down this road. And it just, this idea that there are different forms of gender that are being represented repeatedly throughout the tale, it just seemed to make the act of what Bata does. It seemed to make more sense if we look at it from this angle, that the Egyptians had different. It wasn't strictly, they didn't have this single concept of man, but they had variations of its form.
That's fascinating.
I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, well, I think that this is a great kind of discussion as well, because I think there's a few kind of, I mean, this is read as poetry, this is read as mythology, this is read as, I mean, in its context, I wonder if there were any poetic kind of features in terms of parallelisms or a wordplay or double entendre, that happens so frequently in these ancient texts.
Yeah.
Where you described the scene of, one of the characters asking for seeds to sow. Okay, sowing seeds is a kind of obvious ancient metaphor for, for fertility kind of rites and things like that.
Yeah, and the work of Martin Powell, that you can see in my bibliography, that his work was really principled in sort of understanding the extent to which metaphors and allusions are really used a lot, because the idea that the reason for him to go back to the house is to collect seeds for sowing, even though agriculture is known to be a principal element of Egyptian life, the fact that it does have this sort of metaphoric undertones to sort of sexual intercourse and stuff like that. This is definitely not something that was accidentally done. Like, it's a very specific use of that kind of metaphor. As far as I understand in my research on this tale, most of the sort of parallel research into parallels in other texts has been predominantly about whether it's a folk tale or a mythology, or it's sort of like trying to identify exactly what genre it falls under. And it's really hard to do because the tale adapts from so many different contexts of Egyptian thought. There's things related to kingship, there's details related to mythology and in daily life. And once it starts to take a magical tone, the amount of metaphor and allegories used are just, it's hard to pinpoint exactly where it's all stemming from. But poetry specifically is not something that I have looked into.
I really appreciate that comment. I think like the question in my mind, like predominantly throughout, like even going back and reading the tale itself, was, in what context was this actually used as a text? It was more than just a scribal exercise, no doubt. Was it involved with, one of the cults in particular? Was it found, in a kind of temple context that would indicate initiation ritual? I mean, my mind was just so curious about, because we read literature today, but I think that's the literary texts or those that are just classified as such from antiquity. They had a purpose. They weren't just for entertainment.
The problem I found, like, I wish I could answer your question more specifically. It's a very good question, but the problem I found in my research, and this also might relate to the theme of sort of the predominant focus that I found for this tale and how it's been analyzed, is in its relation to sort of its adaptation of principles from other civilizations. So as far as I understand, it has been, in the context of Egypt, we've understood it to be, we mainly see its importance as a scribal exercise. And the significance of the tale itself is really from how Egyptologists have approached its study and its sort of potential allusions to the Near East and other civilizations.
Yeah, no, I mean, that makes sense. It's a scribal field. Seriology is a very scribal-oriented field, academia in general. So it makes sense that we would interpret it from our point of view first. But at least it's a curiosity. Okay, so we have one last question. Since performity can also, since performity can also have a physical aspect, maybe even aspect where it is meant to be seen. Have you looked at all or any of the artistic representations of similar instances like those described in The Two Brothers?
That's a very good question. Thanks. Thanks for that. It's actually something I would like to look into further, because with this study, I kind of focused more on the textual occurrence. So looking at sort of iconography and artistic representations of how performativity may have been represented, and how the variations in how gender may have been represented, is sort of like the next step that I would like to take, especially maybe focusing on the term ahauti and the full extent of its representations. So that is something I would like to look into in the future. But right now, it was just a textual analysis focus.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, thank you very much. That's really fascinating. I'm sure we could talk about this for hours still. But we thank you for your talk, and
thank you for having me.
Look forward to reading more about it. All right. Our last speaker for today, for this session at least, is Cora Kyler. She's a second-year PhD student at UC Berkeley, and today she'll present a talk entitled "A Pre-Socratic in Arabic Doxography: The Empleticus of al-Shahrastani's Kitab al-Milal Wa al-Nihal, the book of religious and philological sects. Hopefully I didn't butcher that too badly.
That was great. Thanks so much. Also, thanks to Brooke and Jason and Jess for organizing this and letting me be a part of it. Maybe first I should introduce the nature of my research in general, which is quite a departure from probably what has happened, what will continue to happen within the contours of the conference. I work on kind of the philosophy of mathematics, and I use Arabic predominantly, and also Greek primary texts, not and of course do attempt to do a thick historiographical contextual scaffolding, but I also believe that revisiting the text and doing a sort of genealogy of ideas might probably provide sort of fertile grounds to actually make interventions in fields like theoretical physics. So I am currently working on infinite and infinitesimals and pre-Cantorian set theoretical sort of spaces, and I'm revisiting Ibn Sina and looking for sort of meditations on causality and time intervals and these kinds of things, so that they can actually possibly contribute to the sort of economy of ideas in things like quantum physics, quantum computing, qubits, these kinds of things. So I think it is in general a different kind of orientation, but hopefully you guys are along for the ride. I'm going to share part of the translation that I've done, which is the sort of point of my, oh dear, okay, is this it? Share. Cool, okay, hopefully you guys can see that. So I am trying, I don't have a presentation or anything, I'm just going to perhaps opine for a bit. This is very much a work in progress, but I should mention, so I found this passage on Empedocles in a post-classical historiographical source, kind of like an heresiographical like biographical dictionary that is Shahrastani's Shahrastani's Kitab al-Milal wal-Nihal, which is the treatise on religious and philosophical sects. It was composed in 521 Hijri or 1127 CE. And what's interesting about this sort of biographical dictionary, if you will, is that it uses Empedocles, who's a pre-Socratic in the sort of Greek canon, and frequently with Arabic texts, there's a sort of reverence to a Hellenic past. So there's usage of Aristotelian and then deeply Neoplatonized sort of Aristotelian sources. So anyways, I'll talk maybe first about Empedocles as he's read in the pre-Socratic Greek tradition, and on his work on nature. So okay, so you have Empedocles, who I think he's 521 BC. And he's composed 2 poems on nature and purifications. There is some modern debate which arises in that there's a lack of consensus on the unity of these works. So perhaps they are just one poem, and then they were sort of severed because they approach 2 different subject matters theoretically, which are physics, or a doctrine on nature, and the purifications, which is sort of what is called, like, basically a religious, quite teaching-oriented text. So my focus is, of course, on his poem on nature, which is a sort of a cosmogony account. And within this poem, he's the first one to craft an account of the world or nature, cosmogony, that is the 4 elemental model is still quite potent, even in Newtonian particle physics and atomistic principled physical approaches. So yes, so he is, for Empedocles, everything is composed of 4 roots. They are, which are the elements: fire, earth, air, and water. And these elements are moved by 2 opposing forces, and that is love and strife. And I should also note that the elements or roots, as he calls it, are referred to by the names of deities. Yes, so the 4 elements cannot compose themselves into a cosmos without the enforcing powers of this love and strife. And when love is dominant, the elements take the form of like a unified sphere, which should be quite easy to conceptualize in terms of a cosmological account. And then strife, which is an agitating factor from which the elements are separated and become what the secondary literature is calling distinct masses, but that's quite a loaded term in the sort of milieu that we operate in, based on sort of Newtonian physical program, which is to say it isn't matter which has mass, but it is this sort of elemental accompaniment and a strict sort of interval, a process of integral linkages that bring things into being. So that is Empedocles, and then he is, mentioned in this hagiographical or biographical dictionary in 1127 CE by Shahrastani, and maybe I'll make a note on that text itself, which is a comprehensive survey of Muslim and non-Muslim religious and intellectual groupings known in Shahrastani's time. It sometimes is referred to as the first systematic study of religions, which taxes the imagination a bit, but this is how it's described. And it is, for me, a definitive and really example par excellence of Arabic hagiography, which is to say that there are some literary topos, like the meeting of minds, that are like peppered throughout, or even orienting concepts. And this is not my approach to the text, which is, I think, would probably be an important one to sort of disentangle these literary topos that are undergirding this historical account, but I am simply trying to find the physics. So early copies were found in Persian and Turkish, and it was made known in Europe by Dr. Edward Pocock, who attained a copy and wrote about it in 1649. So within this biographical dictionary, there's 5 introductory chapters, and in which Sharstani arranges his book into 2 divisions, which is the religious and the philosophical sects. The former of these contains an account of the various sects of the followers of Muhammad and the people of the book, so Jews and Christians, and then those who have doubtful revelations within kind of this milieu, which such as the Magi and the Manichaeans of the Sasanian Empire. And then the second division, so namely philosophical sects, is comprised of an account of the philosophical opinions of the Sabians, which are mainly set forth in what seems to be a dialogue between a Sabian and an Orthodox Mohammedan, of the tenets of various Greek philosophers, and at times the fathers of the Christian Church, and also sort of the famous physicians of the Arab world. So Ibn Sina, who has a warm place in my heart. And then the work terminates with an account of like the tenets of this sort of genealogy of religious and philosophical systems pertinent and the sort of world that they're operating in. So yeah, that's sort of some background, and there has been some modern historiographical work on this, and that is where the term Pseudo-Empedocles has been birthed from, which is to say that there's a myth of the Pseudo-Empedocles that goes back to the 19th century, and this was erected by Solomon Monk and David Kaufman, who believe that they had found in 3 16th century actually Hebrew Kabbalistic texts the fragments of the Book of 5 Substances. The 5th quote-unquote substance, I think, is the Aristotelian addition of a maybe 5th element, which is sort of like a planetary matter. And then Miguelis and Palacios in 1940 also took a liking to this Shahrastani's account of Empedocles and his terms of on nature, and he attempted to show the presence of a Pseudo-Empedoclean tradition in a variety of Arabic, Jewish, and Muslim texts, continuing actually all the way into Latin scholasticism. So yeah, and I think but I should know that within this the Palacios's 1914 essay, he does distinguish between Arabic iteration of Pseudo-Empedocles and the pre-existing Pseudo-Empedocles, predominantly in Greek texts, where the Arabic iteration reflects a continuation and an elaboration of like an authentic late antique Neoplatonist tradition about Empedocles. And he, I think, at times questions as to whether this is inflected with these Ismaili threads. So yeah, that's sort of just the grounds in which I came to this text. And then this is here my translation so far. It is not done. But there are some very interesting passages, which is yeah, so we have, so The first effect, the creator, is the material. The second effect is cause through the mediation of the creator and is the intellect. The third is cause through their mediation and is the soul. These are simple and absolute things, and what comes after them are composed things. He Empedocles states, okay, this is on logic, but yeah, so there's a clear sort of erection of a world that looks quite a bit like a Platonic account, which is to say that there's a world of forms, and they have poor and sort of necessarily lacking instantiations in the unmattered world, and that you can get to a conceptualization of the form by a series of causal linkages, in which is interesting when you investigate particularly motion and the movement of perhaps what could be called void, and then the presence of motion in matter. Yeah, and then, okay, and then we have, this is in Shahrastani's account, who's saying, then Empedocles said, the prime element is simple with respect to the essences and the intellects, which is below it. So this is sort of this chain of transmission, without it being absolutely simple. That is one and pure with respect to the essence of the creator, because there is no effect that is not a composition of composed intelligibles or sensibles. Therefore, the element itself is a composition of love and strife. And from them created are the simple spiritual essences and the composite physical essences. So love and strife became two attributes or two forms of the element, two principles together constituting existence. So all spiritual things were imprinted upon by pure love, and physical things were imprinted upon by strife. And the compounds from it carry the imprints of love and strife, pairing and opposition, and by the proportion of them in compounds. Yeah, so this to me seems to be obviously an elaboration and very much a reduction of the Empedocles as he is on nature, and it is in a way using these Avicennian notions of essence and existence and enthalpy, which is debated very much in physics, particularly of a later post-classical tradition in the Arabic sources. And yeah, so maybe I'll just close it out there. This is very much a work in progress, but I'm happy. I would love feedback, or if, anything like this. And then in addition, happy to share my translation or what I've taken of the manuscript. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Cora. This was really interesting and fascinating to get a glimpse into your thought process and the work involved in translation. You're clearly kind of bridging this gap that I think has been a work for a long time, a work in its infancy still, which is this body of Greek, Arabic translations that we find, the Greco-Arabic lineage of religious and philosophical texts in late antiquity is one that I feel like is like, as a prerequisite, the number of languages you have to master are incredible, and each of these are very complex in their contexts to try to understand. And you've been clearly kind of creating a translation here. Can you give us an insight into the kind of mappings that are involved when you're taking an Arabic text and looking at the Greek kind of references and cross references that are made there, in terms of the context of these words, because each of these words has an etymology. I mean, just as a caveat, whenever I'm talking with someone who says, "Have you read the Quran?" And I'll say, well, I've read it in English, and they'll say, well, no, that doesn't count, because unless you read it in Arabic, then you can't really obtain the full grasp of the words. And I think that's true for any text that's written in a language. So of course, as translators, we have to deal with that kind of divide, the lost in translation. How have you worked with that in your translation, of like bridging this gap?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So yes, because this biographical dictionary, or sort of example of hagiography, it was composed in, what is it, 1165? 1127. I definitely I use much of the debated language, like things like substance and essence, which are sort of like deeply already imbued with all these possible meanings in the already quite varied Arabic scientific canon. I do very much borrow from a sort of Avicennian tradition. So I've just had to like make a decision that I believe that this Avicennian scientific language has been potent in that it is the register functionally of these kinds of historical works that are coming out of a post-Avicennian tradition. And because I don't know Shahrastani's access to the work of Empedocles, I assume it's kind of minimal. And so I read on Nature a couple years ago, actually, in the Greek, and I don't really use it to actually to compose sort of this translation, because I think it's coming from a very pre-existing Arabic scientific vocabulary. But that is a good point, in that maybe revisiting the Greek, and at least looking at like continuity of terms, could maybe help disentangle some of the impasses that I've come to, and in addition, allow for me to extend outside the fold of understanding even an historical accounts of pre-Socratic within the actually quite imprisoning contours of a Platonized Aristotelian account, which sometimes claims to describe in a holistic sense the continuation of scientific investigations, particularly in the quatavarium within the Arabic canon. So, yeah.
Well, I really want to commend your use and focus actually on the kind of the Arabic tradition, because like, at least from what I've read, like for example, Uwe Vagapol, who in 2008 wrote Aristotle's Rhetoric in the East,
Mhm.
gives a survey of how this field has been dominated by Greek philologists.
Yeah.
And I think that there's an inherent problem there in the, like, you make a huge assumption as a Greek philologist that the Arabic kind of philosophers and philologists had access to these texts, like you were saying. To what degree? I think that's an excellent question to be asking, and you're standing on a much firmer ground to just be approaching it from in the Arabic context and from that century, rather than going back to 425 when when Empedocles was like writing.
Mhm.
So I think there's a strength in your approach by kind of not delving too deeply and imposing that tradition onto this one, but rather trying to flesh out and ask this question that you asked, did these authors actually have access to these, classical texts, or are they riffing off something that was passed down through, oral tradition or through other means?
Right.
And I think that's always the challenge for historiography, is to say, like, did the author, what were the books and materials that any author had in their creation of a new text here? And so I think that's a really valuable question. Okay, so one other question I think that Heidi Hilliker asked is, very interesting talk, Cora. Is there any connection here to 5 principles recognized by Al-Razi?
Oh yeah.
God, soul, matter, time, and place, from a physics standpoint?
Yeah, that is that's a really good question. I am super interested in Razi. What I understand of the Razian intervention in philosophical programs, which physics falls under in this time, is actually at its core an ontological classification of more general things. So you get to a nice sort of chain, ontological sort of chain of transmission, like ocean or something like this. And it privileges as philosophically and logically sound that a simple elegance is right. Which is actually has a lot of downstream implications in terms of as how much Razi is in this. Probably not much, but in terms of this I see as at its core kind of an Avicennaized physical or cosmological program, and that is clearly there's a legacy of Razi interacting and comporting himself to these important sort of Avicennian physical concepts. So yeah, it has all to do, and also tentatively, I'm not sure what to do with what I understand of Razi's intervention and his program. So yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's great to see this, and we look forward to reading your translation.
Yeah, if anyone wants it, email me.
Excellent. I believe we have some final comments by Brooke, organizer.
Hi, thanks. So thank you very much, Adam, for being our moderator today. And again, thank you to all of our panelists for presenting today. For all of our attendees, please join us again tomorrow at 2 p.m. PST for our second panel. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.